What if I told you there was a time when dying at 500 years old meant you died young? When grandfathers could meet their descendants 40 generations later? When one man witnessed almost an entire millennium pass before his eyes? The Bible doesn't treat these as legends. It records them as cold, hard facts, with names, ages, and family trees. Methuselah, 969 years. Adam, 930 years. Noah, 950 years. But here's where it gets strange. Something happened. Something catastrophic. Within just 10 generations after Noah, human lifespans collapsed from 600 years to barely 200. Then down to 120. As if someone flipped a switch on human biology itself. The Bible documents this decline with mathematical precision, generation by generation, name by name. Ancient cultures worldwide whisper the same secret. Their ancestors also lived for centuries. Modern laboratories discover organisms that barely age at all. The science says it's possible. History says it happened. So what killed our immortality? What force could reshape human DNA across the entire planet? The answer lies buried in the most controversial chapters of Genesis, and the truth is far stranger than you imagine. When you open Genesis chapter 5, you find something that looks like a family tree. But this isn't just any family tree. It's a record of people who lived longer than anyone alive today could ever imagine. The chapter starts with Adam, the very first human being God created. After Adam and Eve left the Garden of Eden, they had children and built a life in a world that was completely new. Genesis 5:5 tells us plainly, "Thus all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died." 930 years. Think about that for a moment. Adam had centuries to watch his family grow, to see his children have children, and those children have children of their own. He lived through nearly 1,000 years of human history. But Adam wasn't alone in this. His son Seth, the one born after Abel was murdered by Cain, also lived an incredibly long life. Genesis 5:8 records, "Thus all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died." Just 18 years shorter than his father. Then came Enosh, Seth's son. Genesis 5:11 states, "Thus all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died." The pattern continues with each generation. Kenan lived his life, and Genesis 5:14 says, "Thus all the days of Kenan were 910 years, and he died." His son Mahalalel followed, and Genesis 5:17 records, "Thus all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died." Then Jared came along, and he actually lived even longer than some of his ancestors. Genesis 5:20 tells us, "Thus all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died." These weren't isolated cases or special exceptions. This was simply how long people lived in those ancient days before the Great Flood. Generation after generation, the numbers stay consistently high, hovering around 900 years, sometimes more, sometimes a bit less. The Bible presents these ages as straightforward historical facts, not as symbols or metaphors. The text treats them the same way it treats any other biographical detail: birth, children, death. What's remarkable is how carefully Genesis records all of this. For each patriarch, it tells you how old he was when his son was born, how many more years he lived after that, and his total lifespan. It's written like a careful historical document, tracking the family line from Adam all the way down through the generations. Among all these ancient patriarchs who lived extraordinarily long lives, one name stands above them all. Methuselah holds the record as the oldest person who ever lived. His story appears in Genesis chapter 5, nestled among the other long-lived patriarchs, but his numbers are different. They're higher. Genesis 5:25 introduces him through his father. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he fathered Lamech. But it's the summary of his life that captures attention. Genesis 5:27 declares, "Thus all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died." 969 years. No one before him or after him ever reached that age, according to biblical records. He came within just 31 years of living a full millennium. To put this in perspective, Methuselah could have had a conversation with Adam, who lived 930 years, for several centuries. He bridged almost the entire span of time, from creation to the flood. Methuselah was the son of Enoch and the grandfather of Noah. His position in the family tree matters because it places him at a critical moment in human history. He lived through the entire period when, as Genesis 6:5 later describes, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Interestingly, if you do the math using the ages and dates given in Genesis, Methuselah died in the same year as the flood. He witnessed the world at its beginning stages and lived right up until God decided to reset everything. For nearly 1,000 years, he watched humanity spread across the earth, watched civilization develop, and watched evil grow. His name has become synonymous with extreme old age. Even today, when people want to describe something incredibly ancient, they call it old as Methuselah. But in the biblical record, he's not presented as a curiosity or a miracle. He's simply part of the genealogical record, the longest-lived link in the chain connecting Adam to Noah. Right in the middle of all these patriarchs who lived for centuries, there's someone whose story takes a completely different turn. Enoch, the father of Methuselah, stands out not because he lived longer than everyone else, but because his life ended in a way that no one else's did. Genesis 5:21-22 introduces him like the others. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after he fathered Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. That phrase, walked with God, appears twice in Enoch's short biography, which is unusual. Most of the other patriarchs don't get this kind of spiritual description, just their ages and descendants. Then comes the part that makes Enoch different from everyone else in Genesis 5. Instead of the formula "and he died" that closes every other patriarch's account, Genesis 5:24 says something strange. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. He was not. That's how the Bible describes it. Enoch didn't die. He lived 365 years total. Genesis 5:23 confirms this, which sounds like a lot to us, but compared to his neighbors who were living 800, 900, even 969 years, Enoch's time on earth was remarkably short. He lived less than half as long as most of his contemporaries. But the Bible makes it clear this wasn't a tragedy or an early death. God simply took him. The text doesn't explain where God took him or exactly how it happened. It just states it as a fact. Enoch was walking with God so closely that one day he walked right off the earth and into God's presence without dying first. This makes Enoch the exception in an era of extremely long lives. Everyone around him was living for centuries, dying natural deaths after hundreds of years. But Enoch's relationship with God was so unique that God removed him from the earth entirely while he was still relatively young by the standards of his time. His father Jared lived 962 years. His son Methuselah lived 969 years. But Enoch, he walked with God for 300 years after Methuselah was born, and then he simply left. Noah's story marks a turning point in the pattern of human lifespans. He lived in both worlds. The ancient world before the flood, where people routinely lived for centuries, and the new world after the flood, where things began to change. Genesis 5:32 tells us, after Noah was 500 years old, Noah fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. He was already 500 years old when he became a father to the 3 sons who would repopulate the earth. By the standards of his time, this wasn't unusual. His ancestors had children at various ages throughout their long lives. Then came the flood. Genesis 7:6 records, Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters came upon the earth. He had already lived longer than most people today can imagine, and he was about to experience something no one else in history would witness. the complete destruction and renewal of the world. After the floodwaters receded and Noah's family emerged from the ark, life continued. Genesis 9:28-29 provides the final summary. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. 950 years total. Noah fits right into the pattern of the pre-flood patriarchs in terms of his own lifespan. But here's what makes his generation transitional. His sons didn't quite reach the same ages. The text tells us in Genesis 11:10-11 that Shem, who was born before the flood, lived after he fathered Arpachshad 500 years. That means Shem lived around 600 years total, still extraordinary, but noticeably shorter than his father's 950. This is the first sign that something changed. Noah himself lived almost as long as the pre-flood patriarchs, but his children started showing a decline. They were born before the flood, lived through it as young men, and then spent their remaining centuries in the new world. The world they knew as children vanished beneath the waters. The world they grew old in was fundamentally different. Noah stood with one foot in the old world and one in the new. He personally connected the age of the ancient patriarchs to the age that was coming, where lifespans would begin their steady decline. He buried his father Lamech before the flood. He watched his sons have children, grandchildren, and many generations of descendants in the post-flood world. He was the bridge between two eras of human history. After the flood, when you start reading the genealogies in Genesis 11, you notice something changing. The numbers are still high by our standards, but they're dropping, slowly at first, then more rapidly with each generation. Shem, Noah's son, fathered Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. Genesis 11:10-11 records, when Shem had lived 100 years, he fathered Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. And Shem lived after he fathered Arpachshad 500 years and had other sons and daughters. This puts Shem's total lifespan around 600 years, a significant drop from his father, Noah's 950 years, but still 6 centuries of life. Then came Arpachshad, who was born in the new world after the flood. Genesis 11:12-13 states, when Arpachshad had lived 35 years, he fathered Shelah. And Arpachshad lived after he fathered Shelah 403 years and had other sons and daughters. Adding these together gives Arpachshad 438 years total. That's a drop of over 150 years from his father's generation. The pattern continues with Shelah. Genesis 11:14-15 says, when Shelah had lived 30 years, he fathered Eber, and Shelah lived after he fathered Eber 403 years and had other sons and daughters. Shelah lived 433 years total, just slightly less than his father. Now here's where it gets interesting. Eber came next, and Genesis 11:16-17 tells us, when Eber had lived 34 years, he fathered Peleg. And Eber lived after he fathered Peleg 430 years and had other sons and daughters. Eber's total of 464 years actually represents a slight increase from his father and grandfather, a small blip upward in the otherwise downward trend. But this was the last gasp of the truly long lifespans. Something was clearly changing in the post-flood world. The people born after the flood weren't reaching the ages of those born before it. Each generation was losing decades or even centuries of lifespan. The world that emerged from the floodwaters was different in some fundamental way, and human bodies were responding to that difference. These weren't sudden deaths or tragedies. People still lived for centuries, 400, 430, 460 years. By our standards, these are impossible ages. But compared to the 900-year lifespans of the pre-flood world, the decline was real and measurable. The Bible records it generation by generation, watching the numbers drop as humanity spread across the post-flood earth. Eber's son, Peleg, marks one of the most dramatic drops in human lifespan recorded in the Bible. His generation didn't just see a gradual decline, It saw lifespans cut roughly in half within a single generation. Genesis 11:18-19 gives us the facts. When Peleg had lived 30 years, he fathered Reu, and Peleg lived after he fathered Reu 209 years and had other sons and daughters. That puts Peleg's total lifespan at 239 years. His father Eber lived 464 years. In one generation, humanity lost over 200 years of life, but Peleg's story includes one cryptic detail that might explain this dramatic change. Genesis 10:25 says, "To Eber were born 2 sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. In his days the earth was divided." The Bible doesn't elaborate on what this division was, but something significant happened during Peleg's lifetime, something important enough to name him after it. His name literally means division. Many scholars connect this division to the Tower of Babel event described in Genesis 11, where God confused human languages and scattered people across the earth. Whether the division was linguistic, geographical, or both, it represented a major disruption to human civilization. After Peleg, the decline continued, but at a slightly slower pace. Genesis 11:20-21 records, "When Reu had lived 32 years, he fathered Serug. And Reu lived after he fathered Serug 207 years and had other sons and daughters. Reu lived 239 years total, the same as his father Peleg. Then Serug." Genesis 11:22-23 says, "When Serug had lived 30 years, he fathered Nahor. And Serug lived after he fathered Nahor 200 years and had other sons and daughters." Serug reached 230 years, still hovering around the same range. Nahor came next, and Genesis 11:24-25 tells us, "When Nahor had lived 29 years, he fathered Terah. And Nahor lived after he fathered Terah 119 years and had other sons and daughters." Nahor's total of 148 years represents another significant drop. Within a few generations after Peleg, lifespans had fallen from the 200s down to the 100s. The slide was accelerating. Whatever happened in Peleg's days, the division of the earth, seems to have triggered or coincided with a rapid decrease in how long humans could live. The age of the supercentenarians was ending quickly. By the time we reach Abraham, lifespans had stabilized in a new range. Still far beyond modern experience, but nowhere near the ancient patriarchs. These were the last generations of people who would live past 100 years as a normal expectation. Terah, Abraham's father, appears in Genesis 11:32. "The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran." 205 years. Longer than Nahor his father, but still well below the pre-flood standards. Terah lived long enough to see his son Abraham grow into adulthood and receive God's call to leave their homeland. Abraham himself, the father of the Hebrew nation, lived a long life by any standard. Genesis 25:7-8 records, "These are the days of the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people." The text describes 175 years as a good old age, suggesting this was considered a full and satisfying lifespan for that era. Isaac, Abraham's son, lived even longer. Genesis 35:28-29 states, "Now the days of Isaac were 180 years. And Isaac breathed his last, and he died and was gathered to his people, old and full of days." Isaac outlived his father by 5 years, reaching 180, a respectable age that still fell short of earlier generations. Jacob, Isaac's son, had a harder life filled with struggles and displacement. When Pharaoh asked Jacob about his age, Genesis 47:9 records his answer. "And Jacob said to Pharaoh, The days of the years of my sojourning are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their sojourning. Jacob himself recognized he wasn't living as long as his ancestors. Genesis 47:28 later tells us, "And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. He lived 147 years total, 33 years less than his father, 28 years less than his grandfather." Then we come to Joseph, Jacob's favorite son, who became a powerful ruler in Egypt. His lifespan shows the trend continuing downward. Genesis 50:26 records simply, "So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt." 110 years, still a long life, but barely more than half of what Abraham lived. From Abraham's 175 years to Joseph's 110 years, we see a steady decline across just 4 generations. The Hundreds Club was slowly closing its membership. People were still living beyond what we consider a long life today, but the trajectory was clear. Humans were living shorter and shorter lives with each passing generation. By the time of Moses, human lifespans had finally settled into a range that would remain relatively stable for the rest of biblical history and beyond. The dramatic declines had ended. People were living what would become the standard human lifespan. Moses himself lived a long life. Deuteronomy 34:7 describes his death. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was undimmed and his natural force unabated. Even at 120, Moses was still healthy and strong. His death wasn't from old age or sickness, but simply because his time had come. The text presents his 120 years as exceptional, a full and complete life. His brother Aaron died slightly older. Numbers 33:39 records, "And Aaron was 123 years old when he died on Mount Hor." These two brothers, the leaders who brought Israel out of Egypt, both lived into their early 120s, unusual even for their time. But here's what makes Moses' era the turning point. Moses himself, in Psalm 90:10, describes what had become the normal human lifespan. "The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength 80, yet their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone, and we fly away." This wasn't Moses talking about his own life. He lived 120 years. He was describing what had become typical for most people. 70 to 80 years. Sound familiar? This is essentially the same lifespan humans experience today. Medical advances have improved infant mortality and helped more people reach old age, but the outer limit hasn't changed much. Most people, then and now, live somewhere between 70 and 80 years if they reach old age. The transition was complete. From Adam's 930 years to Moses' standard of 70-80 years, humanity had experienced a steady decline in lifespan over the course of many generations. What took nearly a millennium in the pre-flood world was now condensed into less than a century. The age of extraordinary lifespans had ended. From Moses forward, people would live roughly the same length of time. A few decades, maybe reaching 100 in rare cases, but nothing like the centuries-long lives of the ancient patriarchs. The Bible had documented the entire journey from extreme longevity to modern human mortality, generation by generation, name by name. In the beginning, death wasn't part of the plan. When God created the Garden of Eden, Genesis 2:9 describes what grew there. "And out of the ground the Lord God made to spring up every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life was in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." The tree of life stood right there in the garden, a tree that offered something humans don't have today: the ability to live forever. God gave Adam and Eve one command about the other tree: Genesis 2:16-17 records his words, "And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die." Notice what God said, "In the day that you eat of it you shall surely die." He was warning them about death, something that didn't exist yet in their world. They ate from the forbidden tree anyway. When God confronted Adam after the sin, Genesis 3:19 delivered the sentence, "By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return." Death had entered the world. Humans would now return to dust. But here's what's interesting. Adam didn't drop dead that day. He lived 930 years. Eve lived a long life too, though the Bible doesn't give her exact age. The death God warned about didn't happen instantly. It began as a process. Their bodies, created to live forever with access to the tree of life, were now cut off from that source. Genesis 3:22-24 explains what happened next. "Then the Lord God said, Behold, the man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil. Now, lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore the Lord God sent him out from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life." God blocked access to the tree of life. Adam and Eve could no longer eat from it. Without that tree, their bodies would eventually wear down and die. But the process took centuries, not days or years. Their bodies still carried the strength of God's original design, made to be immortal, now slowly dying. Each generation after them inherited bodies one step further from that original perfection. The curse of death spread gradually through humanity, like ripples moving outward from a stone thrown into water. The first humans lived almost 1,000 years because they were closest to Eden. Their descendants lived slightly less, and so it continued, generation after generation, as the effects of that first sin accumulated in human biology. God had a reason for letting people live so long in those early generations. It wasn't just leftover biology from Eden. It was mercy. When humans lived for centuries, it gave them time. Time to think. Time to change. Time to turn back to God. Think about it. If someone lives 900 years, they see multiple generations of their family. They watch their choices play out over centuries. They see whether good or evil truly leads where it promises. That's a lot of time to reconsider your path. But as time went on, God saw something disturbing. Genesis 6:5 describes what he observed. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Even with centuries to live and learn, humans were choosing evil. Every thought, every intention, evil. Then comes one of the most striking verses in the Bible. Genesis 6:3 records God's decision. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, his days shall be 120 years. God set a limit. He declared that humans wouldn't continue living such long lives. The time of patience was ending. This statement came right before the flood. God was essentially saying, I've given humanity long enough. They've had centuries per person to get it right, and they've only gotten worse. From now on, 120 years will be the limit. Some scholars think this meant 120 years until the flood would come. Others think it meant human lifespans would eventually be capped at 120 years. Either way, it marked the end of an era. God's Spirit had been working with humanity, giving them time and opportunity. But there comes a point when patience meets its boundary. The long lifespans of the early world represented God's extended grace period, a chance for people to repent and turn back to Him. When that chance was consistently rejected, when even 900 years of life couldn't produce righteousness, God shortened the time humans would have. The decline in lifespans after the flood reflected this new reality. People no longer had centuries to make their choices matter. They had decades. The urgency increased. The opportunity window narrowed. This wasn't cruelty. It was God adjusting His approach to a humanity that had proven what they would do with unlimited time. After Cain killed Abel, Adam and Eve had another son. Genesis 4:25 records, "And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him." Seth became the new beginning, the replacement for the son who had walked with God. Something special happened in Seth's generation. Genesis 4:26 says, "To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh." At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. This is the first mention of people actively worshipping God by name. Seth's line became the faithful line, the ones who remembered God and called on Him. Now look at Genesis chapter 5. It traces the family line from Adam through Seth, then through Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and finally Noah. Every single one of these men lived for centuries, the long lifespans we've already discussed. But they weren't just living long lives, they were preserving something crucial: knowledge of God. Here's why this matters. Adam lived 930 years. His son Seth was born when Adam was 130, which means they lived together for 800 years. Seth lived 912 years. Enosh was born when Seth was 105. So they overlapped for 807 years. Do you see the pattern? Each generation lived alongside multiple other generations for centuries at a time. This created an unbroken chain of testimony. Adam could personally tell Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, and Methuselah about the Garden of Eden. He could describe what life was like before sin, what God's voice sounded like when they walked together in the garden, and what happened the day everything changed. These weren't stories passed down through many generations and distorted over time. They were first-hand accounts shared directly across centuries. Methuselah was born when Adam was 687 years old. That means Methuselah potentially heard stories about Eden directly from Adam himself. Then Methuselah lived 969 years, which meant he could pass those same stories to Noah. The chain remained unbroken. Adam to Methuselah to Noah, 3 people covering the entire span from creation to the flood. The long lifespans served a spiritual purpose. They preserved truth. In a world without written scripture, without books or recording devices, the way you kept information accurate was through living witnesses who could testify, "I was there," or "I heard it from someone who was there." God's truth about creation, about Eden, about sin and its consequences, all of it stayed alive through these long-lived patriarchs who could personally verify the accounts. The Sethite line didn't just live long, they carried the memory of God through a darkening world. The world before the flood had become something God never intended. We've already read Genesis 6:5 about how evil human thoughts had become. But the very next verse shows how God felt about it. Genesis 6:6-7 says, "And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them." God was starting over. The flood would wash away the corrupted world and give humanity a fresh beginning. But this reset came with changes that would affect how long people lived. Before the flood, we see those 900-year lifespans. After the flood, as we've already covered, the numbers start dropping quickly. The flood marked the dividing line. Something about the world before allowed for extreme longevity. Something about the world after didn't. When Noah and his family left the ark, they stepped into a fundamentally different world. Genesis 8:21-22 records God's promise. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. Notice what God mentions: seasons, temperature changes, cycles of planting and harvesting. This suggests the post-flood world had weather patterns and seasonal variations that may not have existed before. The statement, I will never again curse the ground because of man, is interesting because God had already cursed the ground back in Genesis 3:17 when Adam sinned. So what does this mean? It suggests the flood itself was another level of curse or judgment on the ground, a catastrophic reshaping. And God promised not to do that again. The flood reset the world physically, and it reset humanity numerically. 8 people survived, just 8. All future humans would descend from Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their 3 wives. This was a genetic bottleneck, a fresh start with a small population, but it was also a spiritual reset. The wickedness that had filled the earth was gone. Drowned in the floodwaters, humanity had a second chance to get things right. Yet God's statement in Genesis 6:3 about limiting human days to 120 years had already been declared before the flood. The reset came with new rules. The age of extreme longevity was ending. The flood marked the transition point between the ancient world where people lived like Adam and the new world where people would eventually live like Moses described, 70 to 80 years. When Noah's family emerged from the ark, God established a new covenant with them. This covenant included some significant changes to how humans would interact with creation. Genesis 9:1-3 spells it out. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, and upon all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. Several things changed here. First, animals would now fear humans. Before the flood, that fear apparently didn't exist. Second, and more importantly, humans could now eat meat. Back in Genesis 1:29, God had told Adam, Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. Originally, humans were vegetarian. Animals were too, based on Genesis 1:30. But after the flood, God explicitly permitted eating meat. Why does this matter for lifespans? The shift from an all-plant diet to including meat represented a fundamental change in human nutrition. The plants that existed before the flood may have been more nutrient-rich. The post-flood world may have required meat consumption because plants alone couldn't provide everything humans needed anymore. There's another layer to this. Genesis 8:21, which we looked at earlier, mentioned that God would never again curse the ground because of man. But the original curse was still in effect. Back in Genesis 3:17-18, God had told Adam, Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. The ground was cursed to produce thorns and thistles, making agriculture difficult. The flood added to this. The catastrophic reshaping of the earth, the breaking up of the fountains of the great deep, and the opening of the windows of the heavens, described in Genesis 7:11, changed the planet's surface dramatically. Mountains rose, valleys sank, oceans formed, continents shifted. The relatively uniform world before the flood became a world of extremes: deserts, ice caps, mountain ranges, deep ocean trenches. God's promise in Genesis 8:22 about seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, suggests these seasonal extremes were new. The pre-flood world may have had a more stable, temperate climate worldwide. Now humans would face hot summers and cold winters, wet seasons and dry seasons. This environmental stress would affect how long their bodies could function. The ground itself had changed. The curse that made it produce thorns and thistles was still active. The flood had rearranged it entirely, and now humans had to work this changed ground, eat from it, and survive in a world that was harsher than what their great-great-grandparents had known before the flood. These environmental changes created conditions that human bodies, already affected by sin's curse, couldn't endure for as many centuries as before. After the flood, humanity started multiplying again, but they made a decision that would change everything. Genesis 11:1-4 describes what happened. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words, and as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." Everyone spoke the same language. They gathered in one place, and they decided to build a tower reaching to heaven, not to worship God, but to make a name for themselves. They wanted to stay together in defiance of God's command to fill the earth. God came down to see what they were doing. Genesis 11:5-7 records his response, "And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." Then came the judgment. Genesis 11:8-9 tells us, "So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth." Suddenly, people couldn't understand each other. Families and groups who could communicate stuck together. Everyone else became incomprehensible. This forced humanity to scatter across the planet in language groups. Now remember when we looked at Peleg's generation. Genesis 10:25 said, "To Eber were born 2 sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided." This division happened during Peleg's lifetime. Most scholars connect this to the Tower of Babel event. And what happened to lifespans during Peleg's generation? They dropped dramatically from over 400 years to around 239 years, nearly cut in half in one generation. The scattering at Babel created harsh new conditions for human survival. Groups were suddenly thrust into unfamiliar territories, some into frozen regions, others into deserts, others into dense jungles. They had to adapt quickly to climates and environments they'd never experienced. Food sources were different. Water was scarce in some places. Diseases existed in new regions that people had no immunity against. Beyond the physical challenges, there was a spiritual element. This was divine judgment for human pride and rebellion. God had told them to spread out and fill the earth. They refused. They wanted to stay together and make a name for themselves instead of honoring God's name. The confusion of languages and forced dispersion was God's direct intervention to humble human pride and enforce his command. The correlation between this event and the accelerated decline in lifespans suggests that God's judgment extended beyond just language confusion. The Tower of Babel marked another turning point, similar to the fall and the flood, where human conditions changed significantly. The scattering didn't just separate people geographically and linguistically, it accelerated the physical decline that had already begun after the flood. There's a dark side to living a long time in a sinful state. Think about what Genesis 6:5 said about the pre-flood world. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. These were people who lived for centuries. They had hundreds of years to practice evil, to perfect wickedness, to corrupt everything around them. Long life in a sinful condition doesn't produce wisdom. It produces refined evil. Someone who lives 900 years, learning how to hurt others, manipulate systems, and reject God, becomes a master of wickedness. The pre-flood world proved this. God saw that giving humans centuries of life had resulted in them using all that time to become thoroughly evil. So God shortened human lifespans. This wasn't just punishment, it was mercy. By limiting how long people live, God limited how much damage they can do. A person who lives 70 years has less time to spread evil than someone who lives 700 years. They also have less time to influence others toward wickedness across multiple generations. But there's more to it than limiting evil. Shorter lives create urgency. When Moses wrote Psalm 90:12, he prayed, "So teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom." Knowing that our time is limited makes us think differently. It makes us value our days. It makes us consider what matters. Someone who expects to live 900 years might put off important decisions forever. I'll deal with God later. I have centuries. But someone who knows they have 70 or 80 years feels the pressure to make choices that count. The brevity of life becomes a teacher, showing us that we need wisdom now, not later. Death also serves another purpose in God's plan. It reminds us we're not God. Genesis 3:22 showed us that God expelled Adam and Eve from Eden specifically to prevent them from eating from the tree of life and living forever in their sinful state. God said, "Now lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever." He stopped that from happening. Living forever in a broken, sinful body in a cursed world would be torture, not blessing. Death became a mercy, an end to suffering, an end to the accumulation of sin's effects on our bodies. It's a reminder that we're mortal, that we're dependent on God, that we're not self-sufficient. The reduction in human lifespan reflects God's wisdom. He saw what humans did with 900 years. They became thoroughly wicked. He saw that extended life without righteousness was dangerous. So he shortened our days, creating a framework where life is precious because it's brief, where evil is limited because time is limited, and where the urgency to seek God increases because we don't have centuries to waste. God had a plan unfolding through history, and human lifespans played a role in that plan's timing. When God made a promise to Abraham in Genesis 15:13-16, he gave specific timing. Then the Lord said to Abram, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace and be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." 400 years, 4th generation. These time frames only work if generations are measured by the shorter lifespans that had become standard by Abraham's time. If people still lived 900 years, 4 generations would span thousands of years, not 400. The promises to Abraham required a specific pace of history. His descendants would become numerous, spend time in Egypt, be enslaved, be delivered, and eventually inherit the promised land. This all had to happen in a time frame that matched God's larger plan. Later prophecies built on this foundation. Daniel 9:24-26 predicted specific timing for the coming Messiah. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word, to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again, with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off, and shall have nothing. These prophetic timelines, measured in weeks, years, and generations, assume human lifespans similar to what we experience today. The prophecy works because people live 70, 80 years, not 700, 800 years. When Jesus came, he lived 33 years. The disciples who walked with him witnessed his death and resurrection, and spread the gospel, lived 70, 80 years on average. This created urgency. They couldn't wait centuries to share what they'd seen. They had a limited window to establish the church, write the New Testament, and train the next generation of believers. Paul understood this urgency. In 2 Corinthians 6:2, he wrote, "Behold, now is the favorable time. Behold, now is the day of salvation." Not later, not eventually. Now. The brevity of human life created necessary pressure for the gospel to spread quickly. If the apostles had lived 900 years like the patriarchs, the early church would have developed differently. There would be no rush to write down the teachings. Peter could spend centuries personally instructing believers. Paul could evangelize at a leisurely pace, but they didn't have centuries, they had decades. This urgency shaped the New Testament, the rapid spread of Christianity, and the structure of the early church. The reduction of human lifespans aligned perfectly with God's redemptive plan. From Abraham to Moses to David to Christ, the timing required generations measured in decades, not centuries. The promises God made, the prophecies he gave, and the Messiah he sent all operated within the framework of human mortality as it had stabilized. Around 70 to 80 years per generation. The Bible isn't the only ancient text that talks about people living extraordinarily long lives. Other cultures from the same region and time period preserved similar memories, and these independent accounts are worth examining. The Sumerian king list is one of the most famous examples. This ancient document, written on clay tablets, records the reigns of kings in ancient Mesopotamia. Before a great flood that the Sumerians also describe, their kings supposedly ruled for tens of thousands of years. One king named Alulim allegedly ruled for 28,800 years. Another, named Alaljar, ruled for 36,000 years. These numbers are far more extreme than the biblical accounts, but the pattern is the same: extremely long lifespans before a flood, followed by a dramatic reduction afterward. After the Sumerian flood, their recorded lifespans drop significantly. Kings start ruling for hundreds of years instead of thousands, and eventually the numbers come down to more recognizable human lifespans. The structure mirrors what we see in Genesis: extraordinary longevity before the flood, then a steady decline afterward. The Babylonians had their own version of this story. Berossus, a Babylonian priest who lived around 300 BC, wrote about 10 kings who ruled before the flood for a combined total of 432,000 years. Again, the numbers are exaggerated compared to the Bible, but the core narrative remains. Ancient rulers lived impossibly long lives before a worldwide flood changed everything. Egyptian records also preserve traditions of extremely long reigns for their earliest pharaohs and gods. The Turin king list and the writings of Manetho describe dynasties where individual rulers reigned for centuries or even millennia. As with other cultures, these extreme numbers eventually give way to more realistic lifespans in later periods. Why does this matter? Because it means the Bible's account doesn't exist in isolation. Multiple ancient cultures from different regions independently preserved memories of a time when humans lived far longer than they do today. These cultures didn't borrow from each other. They developed their traditions separately, yet they all remember the same basic story: extreme longevity in the ancient past, a catastrophic flood, and a decline to normal human lifespans afterward. The consistency across cultures suggests a shared historical memory. These societies weren't making up random myths. They were preserving traditions about actual events that their ancestors experienced. The biblical account fits into a broader ancient Near Eastern context where extended lifespans before the flood were widely remembered and recorded. The world before the flood may have been fundamentally different from the world we know today. Genesis gives us hints about these differences, and scientists have developed theories about what the pre-flood environment might have looked like. One of the most significant clues comes from Genesis 2:5-6, which describes conditions before rain existed. When no bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground, and a mist was going up from the land, and was watering the whole face of the ground. No rain. Instead, a mist watered the earth. This suggests a completely different water cycle than what we have now. Today, water evaporates from oceans and lakes, forms clouds, and falls as rain. But in the pre-flood world, water apparently rose from the ground as mist. This could indicate higher atmospheric pressure, more moisture in the air, or a different temperature distribution across the planet. When the flood came, Genesis 7:11-12 describes what happened. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened, and rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. This was the first time rain fell. The windows of the heavens opened. Something in the atmosphere that had been holding water released it all at once. Some scientists theorize that the pre-flood earth had a water vapor canopy, a thick layer of water vapor high in the atmosphere. This canopy would have created several beneficial conditions. First, it would have filtered harmful radiation from the sun. Today, ultraviolet radiation damages our DNA and contributes to aging and cancer. A water vapor canopy could have blocked much of this radiation, protecting human cells from damage. Second, this canopy would have created a greenhouse effect, maintaining stable temperatures worldwide. There would be no extreme heat or cold, no ice caps, no deserts. The entire Earth could have had a mild, tropical climate. Genesis 1:11-12 describes how plants grew abundantly, suggesting favorable conditions globally. Third, higher atmospheric pressure from the water canopy would have increased oxygen levels. More oxygen in the blood means better cell function, faster healing, and less oxidative stress, all factors that could extend lifespan. When the flood came, this canopy collapsed. The windows of the heavens opened, releasing massive amounts of water that had been suspended in the atmosphere. After the flood, the protective canopy was gone. Harmful radiation now reached the Earth's surface. Temperature extremes developed. Atmospheric pressure dropped. The entire environmental system that had supported extreme human longevity disappeared. When God created Adam and Eve, their DNA was perfect. There were no copying errors, no genetic diseases, no mutations. They were the original templates, exactly as God designed humans to be. This genetic perfection had practical implications. When Adam and Eve's children had to marry each other because there were no other humans available, there were no genetic problems. Cain married someone, presumably a sister. Seth's children married cousins or siblings. This wasn't a problem because there were no genetic defects to double up and cause disease. As generations passed, however, mistakes began accumulating in the genetic code. Every time cells divide and DNA copies itself, there's a tiny chance of error. Most of these errors are harmless, but some cause problems. Over time, these mistakes add up. It's like making photocopies of photocopies. Each generation gets a slightly less perfect copy than the one before. The first few generations after Adam had very few genetic errors. Their DNA was still close to the original perfect design. This genetic purity contributed to their long lifespans. Their cells could repair damage efficiently, their organs functioned optimally, their bodies resisted disease effectively. But each successive generation inherited more accumulated errors. These errors affected how well the body functions. Some mutations affect cell repair mechanisms. Others impact how efficiently organs work. Still others make people more susceptible to disease. The cumulative effect of thousands of small genetic problems shortens lifespan. The mutation load increased with each generation, and there was no way to reverse it. Adam passed a nearly perfect genetic code to Seth. Seth passed a slightly degraded version to Enosh. By the time you get to Noah, the genetic code had accumulated thousands of generations worth of small errors. After the flood, humanity restarted from just 8 people, Noah's family. This created what scientists call a genetic bottleneck. All future humans would descend from just these 8 individuals. Whatever genetic mutations Noah's family carried would be passed to everyone. As generations continued after the flood, new mutations kept appearing, adding to the ones inherited from Noah. The mutation load kept increasing. The genetic distance from Adam's perfect DNA kept growing, and human bodies, operating with progressively more imperfect genetic instructions, couldn't maintain themselves for as many centuries. Food matters more than most people realize. What you eat affects every cell in your body, how long you live, and how well your body functions. The Bible records a significant dietary change that happened after the flood. In the beginning, God designed humans to eat plants. Genesis 1:29 records his instruction to Adam and Eve. And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food." Plants, seeds, fruit. That was the original human diet, completely vegetarian. Animals were vegetarian too. Genesis 1:30 explains, "And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." The entire creation ate plants. This diet apparently sustained humans for over 1,600 years and allowed them to live for centuries. Whatever nutrients humans needed to maintain their bodies for 900 plus years came from plants. After the flood, everything changed. When Noah and his family left the ark, God gave new instructions. Genesis 9:3 introduces a major shift. "Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything." Everything. God now permitted humans to eat animals. Why the change? The post-flood world may not have had the same variety or quality of plants. The catastrophic flood would have destroyed the entire pre-flood ecosystem. The plants that grew afterward were growing in different soil, under different atmospheric conditions, in a world with seasons and temperature extremes that didn't exist before. Eating meat introduced new elements to the human diet. Animal flesh contains proteins, fats, and nutrients not found in plants, or at least not in the same forms or concentrations. But meat consumption also brought new challenges to human health. Animal fats can contribute to heart disease. Meat is harder to digest than plants, requiring more energy and putting more stress on the digestive system. Genesis 9:2 describes the new relationship between humans and animals. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, and upon all the fish of the sea. Animals now feared humans. This suggests that before the flood, animals were tame and approachable. Now they were wild and dangerous. The shift from a plant-based diet that sustained 900-year lifespans to a diet that included meat coincided with the decline in human longevity. Whether meat itself was harmful or whether the need for meat indicated that plants were no longer adequate, the dietary change marked a fundamental shift in how human bodies were fueled. The flood didn't just cover the earth with water, it completely restructured the planet. Genesis 7:11 describes what happened when the flood began. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. Notice it mentions two sources of water. The windows of the heavens opening refers to water coming from above, rain. But the fountains of the great deep, bursting forth, refers to water coming from below, from under the Earth's surface. This suggests massive geological activity. Underground water reserves broke through the Earth's crust. This would have involved volcanic activity, earthquakes, and the splitting of the ground. The world that emerged after the flood looked nothing like the world that went into it. Mountains that didn't exist before were pushed up. Ocean basins sank deeper. Psalm 104:6-8 describes this process. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took to flight. The mountains rose. The valleys sank down to the place that you appointed for them. This new geography created climate extremes that didn't exist before. High mountains meant cold temperatures at elevation. Deep ocean trenches meant different water circulation patterns. Genesis 8:22, where God promised cold and heat, summer and winter, suggests these seasonal and temperature variations were new. The pre-flood world apparently had a uniform, mild climate. After the flood, different regions had radically different conditions. Some areas became frozen tundra, others became scorching deserts. Humans had to adapt to these varied environments, and this adaptation stressed their bodies. Consider what it would be like to suddenly live in extreme cold when your ancestors had only known mild temperatures. Your body would have to work much harder to maintain core temperature. Food would be scarce in winter. These environmental stresses take a toll on the body over time. Beyond climate, the geological changes affected soil quality. The pre-flood soil, built up over 1,600 years, was rich and productive. The post-flood soil was either stripped away by floodwaters or buried under sediment. New soil had to form, and this process takes time. The first generations after the flood were farming less productive land. The combination of geological restructuring and climate extremes created a world far more hostile to human life than the pre-flood world had been. Bodies designed to function for centuries in a stable environment couldn't maintain themselves as long in a world of temperature extremes, harsh weather, and poor soil. Some people question how humanity could have reached billions of people if we all descended from just 8 flood survivors. But when you understand how population growth works, especially with extended lifespans, the math actually supports the biblical account. After the flood, Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives, had to repopulate the earth. Genesis 9:1 records God's command, and God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." Here's where the extended lifespans become important. Shem lived 600 years total. Even if he could only father children for, say, 300 of those years, that's a massive window for reproduction. If Shem and his wife had one child every 5 years for 300 years, that's 60 children. Not all would survive to adulthood, but even a fraction of that number represents enormous reproductive potential. Now apply this to the next generation. If Shem had 40 children who survived to adulthood, and each of them lived 400 plus years and had similar reproductive windows, the numbers explode. That second generation could easily reach thousands of people. The third generation could reach hundreds of thousands or millions. Population growth is exponential when conditions are favorable. Each generation is larger than the one before. With long lifespans, multiple generations overlap. Shem could have great-great-great-grandchildren while still having more children of his own. Let's use conservative estimates. Assume each couple has an average of just 6 children who survive to adulthood. Assume a generation is roughly 40 years. Starting with 3 couples, in just 10 generations, you'd have over 100,000 people. In 15 generations, you'd have millions. The Bible provides genealogies that confirm this rapid expansion. By the time of Abraham, just a few centuries after the flood, there were already multiple nations, cities, and kingdoms. Genesis 14 mentions 5 kings fighting against 4 other kings, implying established civilizations with armies and governments. This level of social complexity requires thousands, if not tens of thousands of people. The Tower of Babel event also indicates substantial population growth. Genesis 11:4 describes their ambition. Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. Building a city and a massive tower requires a large workforce, hundreds or thousands of people at minimum. The mathematics of population growth, especially factoring in the extended lifespans of the early post-flood generations, easily accounts for humanity spreading and multiplying to fill the earth. When archaeologists dig up ancient sites and study early human remains, they find some interesting evidence that relates to the biblical account of long lifespans. While we can't prove from bones alone that someone lived 900 years, we can see clues about human health and capability in ancient times. Ancient skeletal remains from certain periods show evidence of robust health. Some early human bones are larger and denser than modern human bones, indicating people who were physically stronger. Skulls show brain capacities equal to or sometimes larger than modern humans. Cave paintings and ancient artwork display surprising sophistication. The Lascaux cave paintings in France show detailed knowledge of animal anatomy and complex artistic techniques. These weren't primitive scratchings. They were skillful artworks created with understanding of perspective and proportion. Ancient engineering presents perhaps the most compelling evidence of early human capability. The pyramids of Egypt were built with precision that baffles modern engineers. Massive stones weighing multiple tons were cut, transported, and fitted together so perfectly that you can't slide a piece of paper between them. Stonehenge in England, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, Puma Punku in Bolivia, these megalithic structures required advanced mathematical knowledge, engineering skills, and organizational capability. The people who built them understood geometry, astronomy, and structural engineering. If the master builders of these ancient structures lived for centuries rather than decades, it would explain how they gained such expertise. Someone who practices stone cutting for 300 years would become incredibly skilled. An architect who designs buildings for 400 years would understand principles that someone with only 40 years of experience couldn't grasp. Ancient metallurgy is another example. The Bronze Age appeared suddenly in human history with sophisticated metalworking techniques. People knew how to find ore, extract metal, alloy different metals together, and forge tools and weapons. This requires significant trial and error, experiments that might take centuries to perfect. There's also the matter of oral tradition accuracy. In cultures without writing, information was passed down verbally. But if the early generations lived for centuries, oral tradition would have been much more accurate. Methuselah could personally verify stories about Adam. Noah could confirm what Methuselah told him about creation. While archaeology can't prove 900-year lifespans directly, it does show that early humans were physically robust, intellectually capable, and remarkably skilled. The idea that humans could live for centuries sounds impossible until you realize that extreme longevity already exists in nature. Science has discovered organisms that live far longer than humans, and some that barely age at all. The Greenland shark can live over 400 years. One female Greenland shark was estimated to be about 392 years old, possibly older. These sharks grow slowly and mature late, living for centuries in cold ocean waters. Certain jellyfish species, particularly Turritopsis dohrnii, have a unique ability. When injured or stressed, they can reverse their life cycle, essentially becoming young again. This process can theoretically repeat indefinitely, making them biologically immortal. Bristlecone pine trees live for over 5,000 years. One tree named Methuselah is nearly 5,000 years old. These trees grow in harsh mountain environments with limited resources, yet they survive for millennia. Ocean quahog clams can live over 500 years. The oldest known clam, nicknamed Ming, was 507 years old. Bowhead whales can live over 200 years. Certain tortoise species routinely live 150-200 years. What do these long-lived organisms tell us? That aging isn't inevitable. Many scientists study negligible senescence, the phenomenon where some organisms show little or no increase in mortality rate as they age. Modern research into human aging has revealed some fascinating possibilities. Telomeres, the protective caps on chromosomes, shorten with each cell division. But scientists have discovered an enzyme called telomerase that can rebuild telomeres. Some cells in the human body naturally produce telomerase and can divide indefinitely without aging. Human bodies replace most of their cells regularly. Your skin cells regenerate every few weeks. Red blood cells are replaced every few months. In theory, if cells keep replacing themselves, why should the body age? The answer lies in accumulated damage to DNA and cellular structures that repair mechanisms can't completely fix. But what if repair mechanisms were more efficient? What if DNA copying was more accurate? All of these factors could extend lifespan dramatically. And in the pre-fall world, with perfect genetics and optimal environmental conditions, these biological systems might have functioned at peak efficiency for centuries. Modern science shows that extreme longevity doesn't violate natural law. It exists in nature right now in various species. Given the right conditions and the right genetics, there's no biological reason humans couldn't live for centuries. The biblical account of 900-year lifespans isn't scientifically impossible. It just describes biology functioning under conditions different from what we experience in today's post-fall, post-flood world. If this video opened your eyes to something new about Scripture, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into biblical history. Share this with someone who's ever wondered why Methuselah lived almost 1,000 years. And drop a comment below. What aspect of this mystery fascinates you most? The ancient world holds more secrets waiting to be uncovered. Join us next time as we continue exploring the extraordinary stories hidden in God's Word.